Good evening and good morning, depending where you are, also good afternoon. So this is Henry Huiyao Wang. I'm the founder and the president of Center for China and Globalization. I'm very pleased and honored to host a CCG Global Dialogue series tonight here in Beijing at head office in the central business district in Beijing downtown. And we are live here from CCG Beijing office. So we are very pleased to actually invite the very distinguished speakers for our dialogue tonight. We had Professor Mahbubani, Kishore Mahbubani, and we also had Professor Kerry Brown. We also had Professor Calder, and so we're going to talk about the rise of and also the rise of Asia and its implications for an increasingly multipolar world. But would like to start with a book. Recently we have a new book that it's called Asian 21st Century, written and by Professor Kishore Mahbubani and actually published by Springer Nature, and is only published about 2 weeks. We had 44,000 downloads already worldwide. So we're going to talk from that book on, but we're going to have a wide range of topic on the issue of Asia development and also the impact of the world. So maybe let's take a quick look at how the book is a quick video on the book. So let's take a look. Great, thank you. So we actually had the book launching event last, about a week or so ago. But I'm very glad that today we're going to have a more focused, dialogue, and of course also a topic rising from here. But also, we can cover a wide range of a topic regarding Asian and its multipolar world. So maybe tonight, I'd like to have this dialogue between 3 prominent scholars. One from Singapore, one from USA, and one from UK. Of course, I'm from China. So what I would like first to introduce Kishore. Probably you could give a bit of a rundown of your book. But let me first introduce Professor Kishore Mahbubani, and he's a distinguished fellow at the Asian Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. And of course, you are the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and also Singapore's former ambassador to the United Nations. But also you are a prominent voice in the world of affairs, especially in regard to the issues on Asia and US-China relations and global governance. So I think, it's probably we're going to have you to start to give us some new introduction about this new book you just published, and how the Asian, the return of Asian are going to impact, China and also the US and the EU, and of course the rest of the world. So perhaps I start with Kishore first. Professor Mahbubani,
yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Henry, for organizing this event, and I'm really glad that you managed to get 2 very distinguished scholars, Professor Kerry Brown and Professor Ken Calder, to join us for this event. It shows how much pulling power you have, Henry. I'm very impressed to get such a distinguished panel. I'm going to be very brief and speak for only 5 minutes or so, to give, I guess, the listeners a kind of a preview of the book. And I would say that to explain the book, I would make 3 points about in a sense, the 21st Asian century. And the first point I'm going to make, which may sound a bit paradoxical, is that all of Asia should send a thank you note to the West for creating the Asian 21st century. And I say that quite honestly, genuinely, and sincerely, because if the West hadn't succeeded first, if the West hadn't created this magnificent scientific revolution, if the West hadn't launched the Industrial Revolution, if the West hadn't come up with these sort of breakthrough ideas on how to transform society, like Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and free market economics and all these ideas that, in a sense, propelled the West and made them the strongest and most dominant civilization in the world for 200 years in the 19th and 20th century, are now the same ideas that are actually propelling Asia forward in the world today. So, and the Asians were very intellectually honest. They would admit that if the West hadn't made these major intellectual breakthroughs, maybe we would still be in agricultural, feudal societies today. But it's the West that's transformed the world, and it's the West that's transformed Asia. And as an aside, I will also mention that we should also thank Japan for being the first Asian country to modernize and transform itself, because the Japanese transformation also inspired many other countries, the Four Tigers, then subsequently the ASEAN countries, and then China, and then India, and all of Asia opened up. So you can see what a tremendous job the West has done in creating this Asian 21st century. And so this brings me to my second point, which is that at the time when this Asian century launched by the West is taking off, the West should be celebrating the success of Western ideas in Asia. Instead, sadly, the West is doing the exact opposite, and both intellectually and politically refusing to accept the fact that the 21st century will be the Asian century. And I want to also, as a historical aside, mention that the return of Asia was always a natural development, because from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies of the world were those of China and India. And as you know, I document that in some essays in the book, Asian 21st Century. And so the return of Asia was always going to come anyway. And so this is an inevitable return, and the West should accept it gracefully. But unfortunately, there is, to my surprise, a tremendous amount of resistance to accepting this. In both intellectually, you still have Americans saying, oh, the 21st century will remain the American century, which I find rather strange. And then, of course, you also have on the political side a deep reluctance to give up privileged positions that the West has enjoyed in the world order. And of course, Exhibit A is the fact that even till today, despite pronouncements to the contrary, the United States insists that the head of the World Bank must be an American, and the Europeans insist that the head of the IMF must be European. I can tell you in 2009 at the G20 meeting, during the global financial crisis, the West said, no, this is all going to stop. We're going to select leaders of the World Bank and IMF on the basis of merit and no longer the basis of geography. Nothing changed. 12 years have gone by, and we still have the heads of the IMF coming from Europe and the heads of World Bank coming from the United States. This is just one example of the reluctance of the West to accept the fact that this is a different world. So all this brings me to my third point, which is that actually there is a wiser, more intelligent approach for the West to take in the 21st century. And that's why you notice that in my book, The Asian 21st Century, the concluding section is on multilateralism. And you mentioned that I've been ambassador to the UN. I've been ambassador to the UN for over 10 years, and I still am. I was then, and I still am, many years later, still a passionate lover of the United Nations. And the paradox here is that the United Nations and its ideas and the UN Charter were essentially created by Western thinkers. It's Western ideas, Western concepts, and the UN General Assembly was conceived to be the parliament of man representing the views of the whole world. And so, in a sense, if you want to create a more balanced world order to reflect the new world, we don't have to reinvent the world. We can just take the 1945 rules-based order that the West created and work with it. And so, in the population of 7.8 billion people in the world, only 12% live in the West, 88% live outside the West. If you want to know what 88% are thinking, you don't have to go very far. Go to the UN General Assembly and use the UN General Assembly as a parliament of man to listen to what exactly the world wants. And the good news is that most countries in the world, especially in Asia, want to cooperate with this rules-based order that the West has created and actually want to have a more stable world order. And you mentioned China. China has become the biggest beneficiary of the 1945 rules-based order. Therefore, it's in China's national interest to preserve this rules-based order rather than to disrupt it, as many fear would happen. So actually, if we do want to create a peaceful and safe Asian century, we don't have to go far. Let's go back to the 1945 rules-based order. And that's the concluding argument of my book, In the Asian 21st Century. So thank you very much, Henry. I'm looking forward very much to the dialogue, this very distinguished panel you've established. Thank you.
Thank you, Kishore. Yeah, thank you for the point that you just made. I mean, absolutely. I think we are now in the 21st century, and Asian has been developed precisely as you said for the last 76 years of after the Second World War. We had this new Bretton Woods system that China actually embraced on that. Of course, now we have after 76, 77 years. I mean, the system needs to be upgraded, of course, and we have actually China has outgrown, from a very backward economy to the second largest economy. So I think that absolutely, President Xi just gave a speech last night at the Davos World Economic Forum. Basically, President Xi stressed again multilateralism and wants to, support the globalization, and China wants to play active role on that. So I think that this book probably can rouse a lot of a discussion and rethinking of how we can, as you said, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to work together, and even on the same system that was designed and the largest designed and architected by the U.S. But how can we do that? So perhaps I would like to introduce maybe Professor Kent Calder, which is also a good friend of mine, and I haven't seen you during the pandemic, but I still remember your time coming to CCG and to our conference, and we visit you in your office in DC. I'd like to introduce a bit of Professor Kent, and he's the interim vice dean for education and academic affairs, and also director of Rishon Shar Center of East Asian Studies of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. Of course, prior to SAIS, Professor Kent also served as a special advisor to the U.S. ambassador to Japan, and also the Japan chair at the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS, and also professor at Princeton, as you are now in Princeton also, I noticed. But Professor Kent, you have done a lot of study on Asia also. You lived in Asia. You have written books about Eurasia, and also you have also spent a lot of time in China. So what's your take on this Asian rising or return to its to the main global economic scene and politically as well? And what do you see as the U.S.? I mean, this system was kind of U.S. largely designed, but can the U.S. now have a President Xi said, the world is big enough, the Pacific is big enough. Can we really accommodate two biggest Pacific countries, and also including EU, that we can all live peacefully in this world? So what do you think about this? The connectivity probably is the next biggest move In the global economy, and what's your point on that, Professor Calder, please?
Well, I certainly agree with the points which Kishore, Ambassador Mahbubani has just made. And I've also looked through the book. I certainly recommend the book to viewers. I myself, of course, for years, I've agreed very much that we have a global transformation underway. The first book that I did while I was together with Roy Hopkins at Harvard University back in 1982, The East Asia Edge. We were talking also about a global transformation, about the revival once again of a world that, exactly as he mentioned, Asia had been at the center historically, and that world, after the important and creative interlude of the Industrial Revolution and many of the difficulties since, that we are returning to an earlier era. Of course, I do believe, I'll come back to this, that there's a key role for the United States. It's a key power today. It will continue. I believe there's fundamental strengths: America's technology, food supply, energy supply, creativity. There are many enduring strengths that will continue to give it a role, but the world that we will live in certainly has many characteristics of the world that Ambassador Mahbubani is laying out in his book. I can remember visiting Shenzhen in 1978 and coming out of the station, and there was virtually nothing there. And then, of course, just before the pandemic, I was back in Shenzhen again, and the home of much of China's great technology, skyscrapers already, a huge city. I could hardly believe the transformation. And I see this time and time again as I move to the cities of Asia that I've seen really since the time I was a boy. I was in Hong Kong when I was 8. And then going back and seeing how different, or Singapore, of course. And you haven't mentioned Singapore in detail, but certainly it's a extraordinary place as well. I've written about that. I was glad to see Kishore mentioning in his discussion of the rise of Asia, of course, China, but also Japan, and the remarkable story of Japan's transformation of going back to Meiji. Of course, there were dimensions that the world regrets and Japan regrets as well, the militarism and all, but certainly the important, potentially constructive role that Japan can play in this major transformation in world affairs. We keep drawing the dichotomy of Asia and the West, and fundamentally in the sense that Kishore has talked about that, talking about the huge share of mankind which is outside the West. This is certainly the case. I do think a piece of this transformation, and I'm sure Professor Brown will come back to this, also is important transformations across the continent of Eurasia. China's rise, to me, is really a remarkable thing that shows is right at the heart of this global transformation. But no doubt it's also been magnified by the collapse in the early 1990s of the Soviet Union, the transformation more broadly of the continent, the end of the Cold War also, of course, created a different Europe, and the extension of the European Union and NATO and so on considerably to the east, and deepening ties in the last decade across the continent between particularly China and Germany, but with the AIIB and so on at an important point also with Britain. And so there are certainly complexities, but the transformation of many parts of the world, not only Asia, also have to do with this significant global transformation that's underway. And I do hope as we move to the future, I think it means exactly what Ambassador Mahbubani has pointed out. It means a world which certainly is not unipolar, and the bipolar dimensions, the United States and China certainly together have important roles, but there's tremendous instability, as we have recently seen in that dynamic. I certainly hope for a world in which China and the United States can have a more stable and constructive relationship. But I think that is in the context of exactly what Professor Mahbubani mentioned, namely of a broader multilateralism that recognizes the role of other major global powers and also the transnational dimension, entities beyond nation states, and the very constructive role that creative states that understand the broader system, exactly like Singapore, but certainly others that understand the system as a whole and don't have a stake in just some form of hegemony. I think all of those things are going to be crucial to the future. And I look forward to our discussion today.
Good, great. Thank you. Thank you, Ken. I think you've been outlining all those kind of eyewitness of what has been happening in Asia, in China, and Singapore, and Japan. You are the expert on Asia, also in the US as well. So you have been actually witness all that. And actually, this has been, the big development out of Asia in the last several decades. But how the world view it and how we really can mix that with the world development together and then peacefully accept each other. It's really seems now to be a big challenge now, since China and US had this trade frictions or even trade war in the last number of years, and now we're still having this almost bipolar world taking shape. So perhaps I have Professor Kerry Brown to come in as well, and of course I'd like to introduce Professor Kerry Brown. He's a professor of Chinese studies and the director of the Lau China Institute at King's College London, and also he's a former diplomat and also worked in China section of the Foreign and the Commonwealth Office, and also worked here in the embassy, UK embassy in Beijing, but also at you have lived in China, also in Mongolia for 2 years too. So you have read many books, and also your new book, China Through European Eyes, will coming out in May, and we're really looking forward to that great book that you've been coming up with. So Kerry, what's your take of you heard what Kishore and Ken has just said? So what's your take about this important growing relation of Asia and how the world can get along, including China, and what's your view on those issues? Kerry, please.
Thank you very much. And I'm a great privilege to be here with two such distinguished colleagues and experts. In the United Kingdom at the moment, we're mostly obsessed by whether our esteemed Prime Minister partied much last year or not. So I'm afraid lifting our heads to look at bigger issues is a bit of a luxury. But I mean, this is an important issue. And I got two comments. The first is really about what the outcome might be. And the second is, how did we get to where we are now? Professor Mahbubani talked about, the Asian century. In a sense, a bit like the Nash, kind of equilibrium. It would be good if we had a century where everyone felt they were the winner, a human century, as it were. In a recent book on existential problems facing humanity, an Oxford-based futurologist, Toby Ord, didn't mention China, I think, once. He mentioned climate change, nuclear proliferation, artificial intelligence, and pandemics, and meteors clashing into the Earth, which is somewhat unlikely. But he didn't mention China. And yet, we have got to this situation where China almost obsesses a large number of our political elite in Europe and particularly in America, and where even saying that we need to have dialogue has become a difficult thing sometimes. And that seems a strange situation to end up in. As Professor Calder has said, it's not like we have just arrived at a moment when China is prominent. This has been happening for 40 years. And yet, despite all of the evidence and the economic indicators and all of the accumulation of different very strong signs that China is becoming much more significant, suddenly there's this extraordinary panic. And I find that puzzling. An example is the very odd story of a Chinese, a lady of Chinese heritage in the UK who has been accused of trying to influence politicians here from our domestic security, MI5. I mean, if one looks at this story, it's very hard to work out what the story is. People try to influence politicians. Sometimes politicians try to be influenced. If we have a problem, it's the funding of politics and political parties, particularly in the UK, probably in America. And that seems to be more important than whether a particular person is trying to have influence, because in this case, I wouldn't say it was a very successful outcome. When we look at the really strange and panicky and, kind of weird situation at the moment, I do remember about 13 years ago during the great economic crisis, when Chinese investments sort of first really started to appear in London. And there was a lot of discussion in the media about how China was going to buy up the world. Well, of course, that didn't happen. What I do remember at that time were many people who were interviewed about, should we be worried? I think.
Can you say again?
Yeah, can you hear me okay now, Henry?
We lost you for a while.
Okay, sorry about that. Probably it's not a very good link here.
So you were talking about, I guess, Christine Lee, London, causing fear, and then after that, we lost you for a while.
Okay, sorry, I'll go back. So I remember about 13 years ago, back in if you carry on, okay?
No, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay, right. Let me try one more time. So I do apologize. I'm really sorry. Yeah, I mean, about 13 years ago, Chinese investment first started to appear in Europe. And I remember at the time, the position was that we should not be worried about this because our rules and regulations were strong enough to deal with this new phenomena. And that confidence seems to have gone, particularly here and in America and in Australia. There is this odd story of how China is a very, very strong threat to our values, our systems, and it seems to go a long way beyond the evidence. And it seems to make China into a problem, which is a different kind of problem to what it might be. This is not about Asia in particular, it's about China. I suppose the final thing then I have to say is that what really puzzles me in this situation we're in now is for Europeans, China and Asia are not new. We have been interacting for 500, 600 years. We have a long history. Henry just referred to a book coming out this year. It's actually not my book, it's a collection of the key documents by major European figures over the last 500 years about China. These are not China experts. They are major intellectual figures. Leibniz, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Marx, Hegel, Max Weber, Bertrand Russell, Roland Barthes. I mean, very significant figures who wrote about China. The pattern that you get over that 500 years is broadly two narratives, two stories. On the one hand, to idealize China, and the other, to be fearful and demonize it. Leibniz, I suppose, represents the idealization, and Voltaire. They regarded China with its Confucian meritocratic system as a valid alternative for what Europeans were doing at the time in the Enlightenment. And that has continued down to the present day. On the other hand, figures like Montesquieu wrote of China as being an oriental despotic place that we shouldn't copy. Now, in the narratives that we have available, at least in Europe, and it seems to be the case in America and Australia too, I don't see that fundamental structure has changed. It's either to idealize, to look at China as some enormous trade and economic opportunity, or to regard it as a huge political and geopolitical threat. There are two problems with that to conclude. The first is, if you regard China in particular, and other partners in Asia too, as such major problems, how are we going to have a global system to confront the existential problems I talked about earlier, which don't recognize and respect country boundaries? But secondly, with these very extreme narratives, we don't have the tools in our media, in our politics, in our public discourse and debate to deal with what is clearly a very complicated situation. We are trying to use pre-Newtonian physics to deal with a quantum era. This is very, very, disastrous. So I think, finally, we've had the kind of introduction of relativity into physics. We certainly need it into geopolitics. I don't see why we are still haunted by storylines that were put in place 500 years ago that have not been radically contested. And I think that that is an urgent job. It's a job we have to do together to create a more adequate story and a more adequate narrative for clearly an enormously challenging period that we're all moving into. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Kerry. Fascinating discussion. I mean, you've been discussing and also talk about all those historical views on China, but also your personal observations that this dichotomy that we are in, this contradictory we are in. On the one hand, I mean, Asia and China is rising, but on the other hand, the world is not, particularly the Western countries, is not accept that. So there's quite a bit of contradictory there, and so what I think, for example, Asian, for the last half a century, economically has been taking off. I mean, Japan, the Four Tigers, and then China, and so economically they probably recognize. Like also ASEAN is a marvelous success story. Like Kishore has written a book in 2017 on an ASEAN miracle. I remember we had that book publication event in Beijing University, Peking University. I was there together with you. So we see that ASEAN, Asian is rising, but politically, is not, including China, is not really accepted. Probably some ASEAN countries too. So what do you think, Kishore? You think about Asian economically is doing well, and it will continue to do well, and we will probably become the economic center of the world in the next half a century. But yet politically and also ideologically, as Kerry mentioned, this narrative, how we can really find a good narrative to describe that. I think Asian 21st century is a great start. We can talk about, but how we can really reconcile the differences between East and West, and how we can accept each other. That really is the key. So, Kishore, do you have any response for that?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I want to thank both Ken Calder and Kerry Brown for their excellent presentations there. I think they've added a lot to the discussion. But your question, I think, gets to the heart of the issue that we have to deal with, which in some ways also Kerry Brown touched upon. We live in a world in which there are many immediate, pressing global challenges. And I'm glad Kerry Brown mentioned that when this Oxford professor was listing the problems in the world, China was not on the list of problems. But, it was climate change, pandemics, and we can name all of them, So the challenge we have is that there are two imperatives coming to clash in the 21st century. So the first imperative, which I think is the dominant imperative, is that the world has shrunk, and we, all of us, 7.8 billion people, in the past when we lived in 193 separate countries, it was as though we were living in 193 separate boats with captains and crews of each boat. Now the world has shrunk, and the 7.8 billion people live on 193 separate cabins on the same boat. And if you're a cabin on the same boat, there's no point taking care of your cabin if the boat is going to sink because of climate change, if the boat is going to sink because of pandemics and so on and so forth, right? So the imperative to cooperate has become very strong and very powerful. And logically, if human beings were the most intelligent species on planet Earth, that's what they should be doing. But unfortunately, in the 21st century, another imperative is coming to play, which is the 2,000-year rule of geopolitics, which states, an iron law of geopolitics, whenever the world's number one emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, which today is the United States, the world's number one power always pushes down the world's number one emerging power. And as you know, that's what my book has, China One, which is behind my shoulder, is all about. And that's also the book that you kindly arranged for the translation in Beijing or in China too. So these are the two conflicting narratives that are hitting humanity. There's one imperative pushing us to cooperate. There's one imperative pushing the two great powers to engage in a major contest. And so I think here the solution, therefore, is, in my book, I devote a chapter to what I call the 6 billion people. Because out of 7.8 billion people, 101.4 billion people live in China, 330 million live in the US, there's still 6 billion people outside. So it's very important for the 6 billion people outside to try and persuade the US and China to press the pause button on the geopolitical contest and focus on the common global challenges. So I hope there'll be more voices like the one that Professor Kerry Brown referred to, this professor from Oxford, saying, hey, humanity has got much, much more pressing challenges to deal with, and that's what we should focus on. You mentioned ASEAN. If you could talk privately and secretly to the ASEAN leaders, and ASEAN makes up 650 million people, by the way, it's a significant group. Their wish is for the United States and China to really stop this contest and help them deal with the more pressing challenges that they face, which is COVID-19, which is climate change, which is poverty, which is the need for development, and so on and so forth. So I hope that there'll be more voices like the one that Professor Kerry Brown referred to, speaking out and saying, let's press the pause button and everything else. Let's focus on global cooperation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kishore. You really outlined this well. So we had in the past 70 years, the Western countries has really taken the lead, and now the Eastern countries has really catched up. But then the two imperative, as you said, really get into a crossroad and then confront each other. Kind of, we are in some kind of a trade war, tech war, decoupling, and all those things. So how can we solve that? I mean, Professor Calder, you live in the U.S. You see this happen. You see how we used to, this year actually marks the 50 years of Nixon visit to China. This China-U.S. joint communique, issued 50 years ago. And but now we have seen this tight situation with across street of Taiwan, for example. We see U.S. actually has sanctioned over 600 Chinese companies already. And China has actually sanctioned none back yet to the U.S. But you see, the U.S. is, as Professor Mahbubani said, the number one power is really want to calm down on the number one rising power. So there's a conflict somehow there. But do we have a chance to work together now? Because with pandemic, it's such a we lose such a golden opportunity to work together. Also, the U.S. is talking about Build Back Better World, B3W, and China has a BRI, as you are a BRI expert too. So the infrastructure is become the biggest common denominator of the world. Everybody recognizes the infrastructure is crumbling in some countries and largely needed in developing countries. Can the U.S., including EU announced the 300 billion euro European gateway. So can we really work together so that we can really set aside these differences?
Well, you make very important points. I think the first thing that I would say is we need to be realistic. There are areas some areas of deepening conflict. For example, in electronics technology, the civilian sectors and defense-related sectors actually technologically in areas like artificial intelligence, for example, possibly 5G and so on, they are coming technologically closer together. And so there are some natural tensions that arise for that reason. That said, I think the implication of that is there need to be negotiations. There needs to be more dialogue to deal with that particular dimension. But additionally, I think there's a danger in this kind of an era of transition. In some ways, there were even some parallels in the earlier transition from the height of the British Empire to an era of a stronger American role in the world. Misperceptions, Richard Neustadt, paranoid misperceptions, and so on. This kind of thing, and Professor Mahbubani's also talked about this at times, this is easy to happen in a period of transition. So that means, I think, more dialogue and even some formal negotiations. I think we could be headed into eras, just as the US and the Soviet Union had in an earlier age, of strategic dialogue between China and the United States. There are those dimensions, but let me put those to the aside for the moment, because I think the more important one flowing from our discussion here is, as Professor Brown put it, this is should be a human century. This should be an era, as Professor Mahbubani said, also of globalization. President Xi, of course, was mentioning these things in Davos, and his earlier speech, I thought, was eloquent in Davos 2 or 3 years ago on related things, related issues. This is a global era. And there are reasons to say, to think if we look to the intermediate and long-term future, I think to be more optimistic. Demography has not been mentioned here. Of course, the West has grayed over time, and the broad non-Western world, of course, has a much younger population. But particularly places like Africa and South Asia and so on, even China, certainly Japan already, and Korea is beginning. There will be a time 20 years hence or so, 15 years hence, when China, the demographic change and the larger role of senior citizens in society will become more important, which points to one thing which I, as a faculty member of Johns Hopkins University, which is very much in the healthcare and the medical area. I can't help thinking about, of course, we've been significant as well in the Coronavirus Resource Center and trying to understand this pandemic, which is before us. I think healthcare is really a key area, especially if we look to a 10-year, 20-year time frame. Those that have gone before can certainly have lessons for those coming. Japan, in that sense, has some things to say, I should say, for the West, possibly for China, for other countries regarding the problems, the challenges of healthcare and what to do. We need cooperative research. It seems to me it's a tragedy that we have so much of the world population which is not yet vaccinated against COVID-19. China has certainly played an important role, and it has its vaccines. The United States has developed some, I think, fair to say, impressive vaccines as well. And there's a European dimension to this. There's a lot more we can do on the COVID issue, potentially cooperatively. And this is in the interest of all of our nations, because as we've already seen with the Omicron variant coming out of South Africa or the Delta variant coming from India, that the whole world can be threatened potentially by this, the variants in COVID-19. We need better cooperation in that area, as well as other parts of healthcare. Let me say just a word about infrastructure, because you mentioned it, and I know that we agree on this point. In my Supercontinent book, which I'm gratified will be published soon in China, I talk about the infrastructure needs of the whole continent in detail. And of course, China has played a pioneering role. I think as grand strategy, there's no question for China, the Belt and Road Initiative is a astute grand strategy. It also has broader global implications that I think on the whole are positive. I develop an idea, distributive globalism, essentially that rather than thinking about zero-sum conflictual regulatory ties, you do this, we don't do this on, say, trade policy, it's far more constructive to distribute resources. Of course, every problem cannot be solved that way. I do, as I said, I believe there are certain areas where we have to be realistic, but infrastructure is not a zero-sum area. It's a plus-sum area. And many of the initiatives that China has made are important. You mentioned Build Back Better, also European Gateway. I think the major parts of the world understand very well, and Singapore has also played a significant role in relating to infrastructure also. So possibly even thinking we have the AIIB, of course, we have the Development Finance Bank in the United States. There are a lot of new institutions. Would it make sense, and I think you have spoken about this also, to think about a global infrastructure fund or global institutions as well as healthcare promotion institutions from a broad multilateral point of view? I think we need to be thinking outside the box in terms of some of the new institutions, the cooperative institutions in the area of healthcare and infrastructure.
Yes. Thank you, Ken. Yeah, I think your idea of distributive globalism is also a very interesting idea, and actually now we have this the infrastructure is where I think the world is all badly needed, actually. I just talked to your colleague, also is a good friend, David Lampton, not too long ago. He wrote a book about the I River, about this China and Laos railway, just recently opened the last month. So I think, this China starting connecting ASEAN countries already by railway now. So this is really, I think we have to find big things to work on, and big hope to handful. Otherwise, we're going to lose the confidence of build up the relations, and that is really bad. So we have to work, climate change, infrastructure, and pandemic particularly. We really has to work. So I agree with you. That's all the urgent issues. Both China, US, and EU, and the whole world needs to work together. And now I would like to turn to Kerry now again. And I know you and I, we've been getting quite a few dialogues on the China, the dialogue on China, DOC, and also on South China Morning Post webinar bars, and we see this two narrative. For example, the US is emphasized on the American style democracy, and we see also China is holding democracy forums, and so actually, the rise of Asia, the rise of China, I mean, economically is fine. It's only the ideologically and also the governance style, particularly the value that seems Western has problem, particularly for China. So how do you think we can reconcile this? Because the Western democracy also, we see some challenges, problem too, like January 6th, what happened on the Capitol Hill. But you see, the democracy system works in China. We had a meritocracy, we had a consultative democracy, we have a consistency. We've been working from one 5-year plan to another 5-year plan, and also with all the modern decision-making supporting system. The system can be as effective as a Western democracy, as even more so probably. Let's compare with the KPI of all the performance of the country. So what do you think? How can we really, make peace with these two narratives, or maybe how accept each other, particularly for the West to accept China on this value and ideological issues, which you are very familiar with?
Yeah, thank you. That's a tough question. If I were to be extremely flippant, I would just leave this question for the next generation, or two, or three. A bit like Deng Xiaoping, I think, said about, certain political issues. I think on Taiwan, he said, just leave it for the next generation or the generation after that. I mean, because if you were to sort of have someone arrive on this planet from Mars, who knew nothing but could speak, obviously communicate with humans, I mean, I think they would work out pretty quickly that there's one group broadly around the United States as the most powerful that has one view. There's another group broadly around China as the biggest economy, but not necessarily very politically aligned with China. But, these groups don't agree. That's all you could say. They don't get on and they don't agree. And they don't need to try to pretend they get on. I think it's important to stop trying to pretend, because we've got enough issues that dictate how we're going to behave. Climate change doesn't care about values. Pandemics don't really care about values. Government responses to the pandemic have not really varied massively, whether they were democracies, non-democracies, whatever system. Everyone has struggled. They've taken very, very different routes. China's route has been one. The European route has been another. They've all had some challenges, and they've had some successes. Finding the vaccine, for instance, in different places was obviously an important thing. So no one really wins in this. No one loses, no one wins. We all are kind of on a flat earth here. And I think that's really important, that we give up on this idea of there being a conclusive debate about which values are preferential. There are things that work and that don't work, and big issues now are going to dictate what we need to do. We are wasting a lot of time at the moment arguing about these unresolvable values issues when we clearly have evidence every year of our climate being a problem. And Europe, Germany last year had floods that killed many people. China had floods that also led to fatalities. So this is very, very obvious and the same problem. Now, I think COP26 last October is a good example because beyond all of the arguments about who attended and who didn't attend, actually the end result could not and did not, solve the problem, but it gave a good basis. I mean, I think it's really good to look at COP26 and say it is much, much better to have an agreement like that, even though, of course, it's not perfect. It's got many, many problems, but it gives us at least something to work on. And without that, what would we do? And although there's going to be many arguments about how to get rid of fossil fuels, I think personally it's likely that China will move more quickly, but it clearly doesn't want to sign up to binding agreements at the moment before it knows what's going to happen. But it's in China's interest, as it's in the interest of Europe and America, to urgently do something about this problem. So we're all pretty rational. And I wonder if we were just to pause, I think we should have a week when we don't have social media, when we don't have media at all. We just have a week of silence, global silence. And we kind of work out what really matters in that time. And as I said, and I'm respectful of the views of others here too, I think what really matters, it doesn't matter if you're in China or Europe or America, you want a good climate, clean air, clean water, and prosperity. And just finally, the very strange thing about domestic politics in Europe and America and China at the moment is actually they are quite similar. Britain is struggling with inequality and leveling up. America, obviously, is very big issues of the impact of the pandemic on different groups and how unequal that is. Common prosperity in China, as I understand it, is also about trying to level up, because there has been big inequalities during the reform period, with some people gaining and some people losing. So there's a very similar agenda here. And finally, if we look at the kinds of economic challenges that the pandemic and other things are bringing, it's going to be a challenging time for everyone. Growth is going to be really challenged. There's no one that's going to come out of this very easily. So I am interested in how politicians, in particular Europe, are going to be able to sort of maintain this strong conviction that we are in such a luxurious and strong position that we can completely ignore our economic interests and say we're not going to deal with anyone who doesn't agree with us. When in fact, economically, we're going to urgently need to find new partners and sources for growth. And in the UK in particular, because of Brexit, we have obviously complicated our relations with our prime economic partners in Europe. The whole idea was, I thought, to have a global Britain narrative where we had stronger relations with China in particular, as the world's second biggest economy. And yet, in fact, we see this complete ambiguity where we know that we need to have this stronger economic relationship because China is not a big investor in the UK and not our biggest trading partner by a long way. On the other hand, politically, we still think we have the luxury of having big arguments about issues which our politicians mostly don't really have much knowledge to deal with, not many of them. And secondly, wouldn't really be able to resolve if they were given 10, 20, 30 years. I mean, this is a real odd priority. So I think we have to really be honest with ourselves in this. I think that's the most important thing for policymakers, to stop giving themselves the illusion of choice. On many things, we can't dictate what we can do. We can just understand how we're standing and what we are planning to do a bit better. But I don't think that we can give ourselves such ambitious ideas as to try and change the views of others about their values. That clearly isn't feasible, and it certainly hasn't worked so far. And I don't see any reason why it will work in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, great, great, Kerry. That's exactly so. So you don't think this changing value can help or maybe influence each other, but you know, why China was constantly be pressured to you know, on those issues, you know, human right or you know, issues of democracy and things like that, because that was precisely Western countries was persistent on China to change some of those positions. But you're right, you know, those are difficult. But again, as Professor Mahbubani mentioned in his book, you know, from year 1 to year 18th century, you know, Asian civilization, China was dominant, you know, the largest GDP in the world. But for the last 200 years, China falling behind. Now we're talking about the rise and return of Asia, return of China. Can the world accept that? And how can the world accept that? And what are the things need both sides to do? I mean, that's again the question I'm going to ask Kishore now. So what, you know, I mean, I couldn't get an answer from Kerry, but let's see what we can do about this, you know, rightful rise of Asian and China, even though they have a different value in the different countries, even in Asia. I mean, Asia as a whole does not have a unified value itself either. So it's diversified group, but at least economically their integration. We have RCEP getting effective this year, January 1st. It's the largest free trade agreement in the world now, and we have CPTPP, which is largely also Asian country in it, and we hope that China is also busy building up all those economic alliances, where China has also confounded with those military alliances, secure alliances like AUKUS or Quad and things like that. But you know, what can be done? You know, how? But also, Kerry mentioned about this, you know, climate change. And I mean, you know, doesn't recognize value of climate change. But China, you know, on this front, actually now developed the most advanced technology now on the clean energy vehicle, automobile, the largest clean energy vehicle, the largest solar power producer, largest the wind power producer, largest hydropower producer. China is really doing fast on that as well. I mean, that can benefit the whole world if we really recognize each other right for existence. So how can we do that? I mean, I had all of you, perhaps Professor Mahbubani can give some further thought on that.
Thank you, Henry. As usual, you raise very good, challenging questions. You know, when this session began, and I was asking myself, what will be the outcome of our discussion among the three of us? We have one scholar from the United Kingdom, one scholar in the United States, you in China, and me here. We could have ended up, frankly, in this discussion with very divergent points of views, you know. But I have so far noticed in most of the points that are being made, a great convergence of views, you know. So, for example, Ken Calder, when he says that infrastructure is not a zero-sum game, but a positive-sum game, frankly, if America builds a road, it boosts economic productivity. When China builds a road, it boosts economic productivity. It's a positive-sum game. So both sides should build more roads, you know, and say not see this as a zero-sum game at all. And similarly, I think the key point that I think Kerry Brown is emphasizing is about the pressing global challenges that we face. And those are actually much, much more important. And we should all be coming together to deal with that. So, I mean, if people were listening to this discussion, they would end up saying, hey, we can feel more optimistic about the future of the world. But as you know, also, there are voices that are discordant. And that's why, actually, I'm looking forward to seeing very much the book by Kerry Brown on traditional European voices on China, those which idealize China and those which demonize China. There is actually a very strong, powerful constituency, especially in the United States, which is demonizing China today. I mean, let's be very, very clear about that, okay? It's a very powerful constituency And unfortunately, there's a bipartisan consensus of it in Washington, D.C. There's a very strong element of it in the media also. And the net result of it all is that, sadly, even though it is the West that created the whole idea of trying to arrive at understanding through reasoning and scientific analysis, reasoning and scientific analysis has flown out of the window when it comes to trying to understand China in today's political context. I mean, especially, I would say, in the United States, but I think, as Kerry Brown's also hinting, to some extent in UK and Australia too. And the tragedy here is that there's absolutely no reason for there to be a clash even on values between China and the West or China and America, because China is not exporting its values to the West. The West can keep its values. It can remain democratic. It can preserve human rights. China is not trying to change any Western society at all. And China, as we know, in Southeast Asia, has actually stopped exporting communism from the time when Deng Xiaoping came to Southeast Asia and met Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, and they agreed, okay, Southeast Asians would choose their own political systems. And at the end of the day, the best thing that the Western societies could do is to say, okay, let history decide which are the best political systems, okay? And time will tell. And as you know, in my book, I say that if this really is a contest, a black and white contest between democracy in America and authoritarian systems in China, then the West can relax, it's going to win. But if you look functionally at American society, American democracy, as I document in great detail, has become a plutocracy. And that's why there's so much unhappiness among the bottom 50% in America. And Chinese society has become a meritocracy, right? And the Chinese Communist Party has managed to get remarkably the best minds in China to serve in the Chinese Communist Party. So it produces very intelligent public policy solutions, including on climate change. So it's how you define the debate also is very important. So the best thing you can do, frankly, and this goes back to my very, very first point, let's just press the pause button on all these disputes and focus on what's really, really important today. I think this is what Ken Calder was emphasizing. This is what Kerry Brown is emphasizing. You know, when issues of climate change are staring at us in our face, every year that we waste is very dangerous, you know. We should be focused on common human challenges. And I'll be very happy to call it the human century if we all agree, okay, we come together, 7.8 billion human beings, forget our American identity, our European identity, our Asian identity. Just remember that we are all an endangered species on planet Earth. That would be a fantastic outcome from this discussion.
Yes. Thank you, Kishore. Actually, you know, when those tycoon, you know, from Tesla or Amazon, when they fly onto the outer space, when they look down on Earth, you know, they felt that the whole global village, you know, it's all human beings. I mean, we're not no difference at all. Absolutely, you talk about this plutocracy, and you know, that reminds me about the U.S. It's 1%. You said it's, you know, governor of the 1% by 1%. It's true, you know, the middle class for the last 30 years, as you stated in the book, has not gone up anywhere, you know, in its income. Whereas China has been very careful on that. You know, like President Xi come up for the last 10 years, he tackles the most, the last, you know, 100 million extreme poverty, the most difficult part, and totally eliminate that. That's really a big achievement. And also now they're calling for the common prosperity, basically is now looking at the 300 million migrant workers in the cities, you know, fast delivery boys or Didi drivers and things like that. But now in the US, as you said, if 50%, bottom 50 hasn't really gone up. I noticed that the 1% of Wall Street, also the first 10 tycoon of the Wall Street, their wealth has been, has hugely increased even during the pandemic. Yet, you know, this the American, you know, multinationals, making business worldwide, and they are not benefiting probably much of the Rust Belt and the Midwest and things like that. So the local, like I was talking to Martin Wolf, he said business become global and politics become local. They keep voting out anti-globalization politicians to the Congress in Washington, and bashing China and scapegoating China is the only surviving successful strategy for the politics. So how we can really turn that? I mean, China is, trying to help. China already provided 2 billion doses vaccine to the developing world, and yet China is, blamed in the West very often. So, as you said, there's a group of the people that demonize China very much. How can we change that? I mean, Professor Calder, you are living in the U.S., and how can we do on both sides? Probably China also has to get better on its narratives, get better explanations, and but this economic globalization has really created such a big challenge, where China taking a lot of blame now for that, and trade war was an example. Yes.
As I said, one thing I think we do have to realize that in some ways there are forces, technological forces, that are driving us toward the greater conflict. We have to have some degree of realism that I would say, particularly the next 10 years, is going to be a delicate period, transition period. So we can't, of course, that's precisely, to me, what drives the importance of a broader vision, a broader, more effective vision for what can be done, which I think it has to be more concrete. And it involves a broader understanding in the West, I would say, including in the United States, and within the United States, including those parts of the country that, exactly as you have said, have not benefited from recent developments. I know that I was very interested that you had spoken to Angus Deaton, who was a colleague of mine for many years at Princeton University, and of course has written, I think, very eloquently about the problems of the American working class, and so on. So some part, and of course, much of the tension, the actual tension, I think, in U.S.-China relations, much of it is driven by security-tinged issues and by things like technology. But the political side, the political edge on the tension, which in some ways actually is quite irrational, I think is driven by the deepening frustrations of our working class, and by the, in the Midwest and the Rust Belt and so on. And it's a difficult, some of these things need to be done indirectly or through, for example, global funds, or through global initiatives that go beyond simply U.S.-China relations, I think, because the global perspective, I think, politically speaking, inside the U.S. probably could, in the short run, have more salience. That said, it needs to be combined, I think, by something very exactly what you are doing here with the Center for China and Globalization. You have had, I think, some very impressive dialogues with people, opinion leaders. Some of them, of course, are the globalists, our common friends, of course, Joe Nye and Tom Friedman and so on. But also, as I said, I was very interested, you'd spoken with Angus Deaton. And I think reaching out, your role, which of course presents some of the important things that China has done, reforestation, the electric vehicles, including the role which you have allowed for foreign investment, including American investment. Tesla, if I'm not mistaken, has one of its largest factories in the world in Shanghai. So I think understanding a vision for the kind of world that we need, in that vision, some appreciation and increased information about the important things China has done, some attention to the issue of dialogue with our middle class, and increasing the understanding of our including our working class, which I think is politically somewhat pivotal in the United States, even though their actual direct conflicts with China, I think, are far less than is often thought. So it's a complex question of improving relations, but I think the multilateral context, together with an attention to economic prosperity, shared prosperity, and issues where we do have common views like infrastructure and healthcare, I think are quite crucial.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Ken. Yeah, you mentioned about Angus Deaton, the Nobel laureate from Princeton. Yeah, I had a dialogue with him a few months ago, and he impressed me very much with his very solid research that he actually studied American. For example, the life expectancy of the U.S. is dropping a year or two now than before, whereas China's life expectancy is only a year or two apart from the U.S. So there's a lot of things that make his work very impressive. And but I'd like to also finally ask Kerry, and you live in UK, and UK now get out of EU and talk about global Britain. So do you think that UK still have a lot of a role to play? I mean, rather than playing AUKUS, we would like to see UK play more in the CPTPP. Maybe talk with China and let's revive Asia on those positive things. We may have, as Kishore mentioned, we can maybe tolerate different values and system, but economically, everybody share the same benefit and recognize the value of that. So what do you think about UK can do in terms of as now you have a big influence in the West, in US, Five Eyes, and also now Prime Minister is talking about have a good relation with China. So how can UK play a unique role in balancing all those differences?
Yeah, I mean, so the integrated review produced by the United Kingdom as a foreign policy document last April kind of tried to look at all of our foreign policy issues and spell out a bit what the global Britain kind of story was. I think it's a good document. I mean, it's probably one of the best ones that this government has produced. And, it there sort of spells out this idea of a relationship specifically about China being, collaborative, competitive, and then adversarial. So that's the same structure as the United States. I think Antony Blinken used the same kind of division in speaking last year. And it's the same in European Union documents. The problem is that where do we agree with each other on where China is collaborative, where it's competitive, and where it's adversarial? Because everyone has a different view. Now, I think for the UK, we will be led by where our economy goes. Because the whole logic of Brexit was we would get out of, one set of relationships so that we could then become a different kind of trading, investment, and economic entity. We have signed free trade agreements with Australia. I think Japan, they have not delivered a great deal. The obvious one would be with China. And we, in theory, should be able to be free to sign such a deal. Politically, of course, that's really hard at the moment because politically, the United Kingdom is having a difficult time with China. And it's also needing to show that it is aligned with the United States. And I think this will not be resolved until we are clear about the economic impact of the pandemic and of leaving the European Union. As I said earlier, if our economy is very compromised and kind of negatively impacted by both of those things, and I think it will be, then I think we're going to be very pragmatic. The United Kingdom has a strong kind of strand of, business is business and other things are other things. And at the moment, there's a big tension. Part of the government wants assertion of, our special values, of our role in the world, which I think is ambitious and I think unrealistic. But there's also strong support for being pragmatic, doing work on investment and on the economy. As I said, Chinese investment in the UK is 0.7% of our investments from abroad. That's small. That's very, very small. And also Chinese exports to the UK are far more than British exports to China. That's actually increased in the last 2 years. It's become worse. So we should do a lot. And if we don't do that, a lot of the reason for why we exited the European Union becomes even more mysterious. We're meant to improve our relations in terms of trade and investment with partners like China. But if we say, in fact, we can't do that because of other reasons, that's a very different story than the one that we were telling ourselves even a couple of years ago. I think my personal view is that I think our politicians will speak differently when the seriousness of our economic position is much clearer. And I don't take a great deal of attention to what they say at the moment because I don't think that anyone knows what's waiting for us. If the economy is slightly better, okay, we'll probably carry on in the position we're in now. I suspect that that's not likely.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. So there's always economic corporate integration, but also the difference will remain. So finally, we have a 5, 6, 7 minutes now. I left now. I think before we conclude, but I think we have very fascinating discussion, very stimulating discussion. We talk about this, the Asian 21st century, the return, the rise of Asian and China, for example. But now the final question I would like to ask three of you, to give, because just now Ken also said, this next 10 years is going to be probably very, very challenging. And so what do you think of, when would we reach a new equilibrium, okay, we can peacefully coexist, we don't bash each other so much. Finally, Western would accept China as a grown up and and now treated as equal, not really bashing each other. I mean, I talked to Joseph and he would say, okay, maybe by 2035 we will see another a new world of mutually acceptable. So Kishore, what do you think? I mean, you think now we talk about the return of Asia, rise of China. When would the world accept this reality? I mean, how long do you think we're going to take on that? 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20? Well, that'd be really interesting to know those issues. So we love to really talk about that. So Kishore, probably can start. We will probably have 2 minutes, 3 minutes each of you.
Yeah. I think since we only have 5 minutes, I'll give a 1 or 2 minute response. First, I want to completely agree with Ken Calder when he said, let's be realistic. And, the thesis of my book, As China Won, is that the next 10 years, there'll be very rough relations between China and the United States. And I take that as a given, okay? But at the same time, I think after you come out of the storm, there'll be a big storm. There'll be a realization that China's rise cannot be stopped and the return of Asia cannot be stopped. And at the end of the day, if you ask me what is going to decide everything, it will be data. So if the IMF shows that China's GNP is now number 1 and United States GNP is number 2, that changes the whole picture dramatically. And that's the profound changes happening in the world in terms of economic weight and power. I'll just end with 2 statistics. In the year 2009, China's retail goods market was $1.8 trillion. The United States was $4 trillion, more than double that of China. By 2019, China's had grown to $6 trillion. The United States was $5.5 trillion, smaller than China's. So this is what is going to move the markets and going to move the world. And I'll give you another piece of data that everyone should also know. In the year 2000, Japan's economy was 8 times the size of ASEAN. Today, Japan's economy is only 1.5 times the size of ASEAN. By 2030, ASEAN's economy will be bigger than Japan's. Okay, so you can see how the world is being changed by these incredible economic shifts of power. And by 2030, the data will show very clearly that power has shifted to Asia. And I think that's when people will say, okay, let's start making pragmatic, realistic adjustments. And I want to emphasize, this is my last point, neither China nor Asia want to dominate the world. They want to work with the rest of the world.
Thank you, Kishore. Professor Calder, please.
Yes, well, as always, I find Professor Mahbubani's work stimulating. He's been one of the most important commentators on this transition that we have now, and I like his new book, as I have several of everything else, more or less, that he's done. I very rarely disagree with him, but there's just one small cautionary note that I think we should introduce here. Namely, demography is at work. And I, as a Japan specialist, I suppose I'm particularly sensitive to this, but we should beware of straight line projections. I have no doubt that we are coming into a new era where the non-Western world once again will move to preeminence, similarly to what was historically true. There will be a different balance within the non-Western world, and demography will play a role in this. I have thought for many years that the grand strategy of China is astute, and that many of the initiatives that have been done have been, I think, right for the present and the future. But the balance, demography is going to play a role in balancing. Japan has declined economically. European growth slowed down. American growth slowed down. At some point within the non-Western world, probably China certainly will be the largest and the most significant, but China's growth is going to slow also. So, and I think actually that will help to produce what we're all projecting of a decade hence, a greater stability in international relations. Asia will be preeminent, but there'll be a different balance within Asia, I think, than we have seen in the past. And so that too, I think, is in the end will turn out to be a positive thing. It takes us back where we have been saying all along. I think cooperative projects to make it easier in the short run, infrastructure and health, and to negotiate and have China better understood during this period of difficulty that we're in now.
Yes, thank you, Ken. And Kerry, please, your prediction, your conclusion, yes.
No prediction, I mean, but just to sort of reinforce what Kent and Kishore have just said, I mean, I think it's important, the work that you're doing, Professor Mahbubani, is important because we need to, I think in Europe and America, people have not quite got it, this fundamental change that's been happening for a long time, but it's now really real. And I think we should be less sensitive with ourselves. We have this big kind of worry when we hear that there might be a different kind of power, but it's not the sort of power we fear it to be. There are other challenges, but I think the ones that we're worrying about are not the ones that really are worth worrying about. It's something very different. It's a world of complexity we're moving into, and the complexity is the problem, not the idea of, a new power coming and dictating like what everyone's going to do. I mean, that would be easier to deal with. But we are looking at a lot of complexity. So I think the messages of your books are ones that are obviously challenging for people to listen to in Europe and America, but we have to listen to them. Otherwise, events will simply overtake us. And that, in the last couple of years, has sometimes been what's looked like it's going to happen. So we have to make sure we get on top of things again, particularly our somewhat worried and anxious feelings. So I do appreciate the work that you've done and the dialogue we've had today. It's very important. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So thank you all three distinguished guests very much. And I think we're almost come to the end. But I think we had a fascinating discussion. We talk about this new book, The Asian 21st Century, and also the return of Asia, and then also the future of Asia, for example, and also its relations and its implication for the world. I mean, actually, 2 weeks from now, we'll have a Beijing Winter Olympics starting now. And so 14 years later, actually, after 2008 Summer Olympics, Beijing became the only city that hosted both Winter and Summer Olympics. And so 2008, we see China initially embraced the globalization. China initially debarked on the global stage and then embraced the globalization. And also, China actually emerged from the world scene. And then that is kind of a welcome, of course, by the international community. And of course, then we see the 2008 financial crisis. So really symbolized the rise of Asia and China probably in the last, next 14 years. But again, Winter Olympic, again, it's another occasion that China is coming to embrace the world. So we hope that this Winter Olympic will still serve as a great reunion of the world, and there's so many athletes and the country represented will come to China even during the pandemic. So we hope that we will still have a lot of dialogue, we still have a lot of exchanges, a lot of sportsmanship, and also I really like the new motto for the Olympic this year. Since they actually used that Tokyo Olympic, faster, higher, stronger, together. So that's together is really important. So I hope that we felt so thankful for all of you taking the time to talk to us. And my staff was telling me there's 150,000 people watched us online, and so it's really fascinating. I mean, we'll continue the dialogue. We'll bring down the differences. We hope the next 10, 20, 30 years will peaceful time, and let's all work together. So thank you very much, and thank our audience and thank our staff. So thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye.
Have a good time.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.